Mike's on Mike, a conversation about politics, government, and Jacksonville, with 50-year opinion leaders Mike Hightower, Mike Tolbert, and award-winning broadcaster and longtime political observer, Mike Miller.
Welcome to another episode of Mike's on Mike, brought to you by the Jacksonville Historical Society, which is located inside the Jacksonville History Center. And as always, our thanks to Alan Bliss and the kind donors who are keeping this program up and going. We appreciate it very, very much. Today we're going to be looking at one of the iconic events in the city of Jacksonville, the Jacksonville Jazz Festival. Believe it or not, the Jazz Festival has had its 44th anniversary over Memorial Day weekend this weekend. Memorial Day weekend, or not this weekend, but the next weekend.
Yeah.
We thought it would be fun to go back to the beginning. And that's in October of 1980 when the festival began, as some of you may recall, as Mayport and all that jazz. And who better to share the stories than our own Mike Tolbert, who was the festival's founder and creator. And we and the city owe you a great debt of gratitude for that, Mike. You've done a terrific job in getting that thing kicked off. Excellent. How did it come about?
Well, first of all, thank you for that. But I was just in the right place at the right time with the right leadership in the mayor's office. And as you might recall or have heard, back in 1979 when Jake became the mayor, he brought into that office a commitment to change attitudes internally in Jacksonville to try to get us over our negative feelings, which we had, our self-doubt, and also get us on the national stage in some ways. That's part A. Part B, he wanted to do something in Mayport. He loved Mayport, and it was struggling out there. And he saw that on the first Saturday in every May that Fernandina was having a huge shrimp festival with all these people. So he's told me to go out to Mayport. And what he really wanted to do was a fishing tournament. And he said, go out to Mayport and let's go up and tell us what we can do. So I went out, I took my tape recorder, I took a tape with rock and roll, a tape with country, and a tape with jazz on it. And I sat there in Mayport near the ferry slip, and I watched the ferry go back and forth, and I played the music. Because I've always believed music, you got to have music. And I didn't know anything about jazz. But I went back and I told Jake, I said, we ought to have a jazz festival right there. The environment's right, the music would be right. For people, country is stereotype, rock you're pretty well stereotype, but I thought that jazz would cross a line of demographics, and so I recommended that to him. I think he thought it was nuts, but because he wanted to do something, he said, let's go for it. So that's how it got started.
So it has nothing to do with just playing on the name of the old Newport Jazz Festival, right?
I will tell you that from the very start, especially after when we saw the turnout, that first festival, how many people came and how enthusiastic they were, that Newport set the bar for us. In our own minds, okay, how do we now become bigger than Newport? And so we tagged ourselves as America's largest free jazz festival.
Very cool.
All right, Mike, that's helpful, but let's put this in context. Mayport is tiny, and in 1980, it was tiny. There was only one road in, one road out. There's only one way to get across the river, the ferry. So you used the dock where the ferry is, which kind of took care of the one road in and one road out. What made you think that you could pull something off that would have more than 100 people in there and wouldn't bring traffic to a halt? I mean, there's got to have been some doubters. And one, you've been doing this stuff, the logistics. How in the world did you get your head around the logistics? It must have been a bit of a nightmare.
Well, no, you have to keep in mind, this was not my first rodeo. In 1977, I did the River Day celebration with Mayor Tansden skiing in the river. And then in the previous August, we had done Coke Fever in 5 days and 50,000 people showed up. There were 100,000 at the River Day celebration. So I had some knowledge about how to put some things together. Now, what you're saying is absolutely the damn truth. I know I'm closing the ferry, And we built a stage right there at the ferry slip, so we had to close the ferry. And that is a state highway, basically. And I remember that Mayor Godbow's chief administrative officer, Don McClure, said, they're never going to let you close that ferry. Well, Governor Graham's top assistant at that time was a guy named Dick Burroughs, who had been a county commissioner in Jacksonville. And so I reached, and he was a good friend with Mayor Godbow. So I reached out to him, and the next thing you know, they can close that ferry for us. So when that happened, Phil Clare was the music editor of the Times Union. And I remember Phil was telling me, because I said, we're going to do 13 acts in 13 hours. We're going to do a different 50-minute acts, and we're going to have 10 minutes to reset the stage, and we're going to do that. And Phil said, that ain't going to happen. You're being crazy. And I would never forget that day, walking through the crowd about 4 o'clock in the afternoon after several hours of this festival going on, and seeing Clare sitting there in a lounge chair, a beach chair, and he stopped me as I went by. He stopped me and he said, I can't believe you're doing this. I can't believe this is happening. But we did, and I did 5 festivals. And the only time that we were not on time, the only one that was late was Spiral's Hour, in the very last festival I did in the very last act. And I'll tell you more about that in a little bit.
Well, how did the people in Mayport react to this? Were they excited about the idea of it, or did they feel that their community was going to be paralyzed for that weekend and they wouldn't be able to do anything?
They liked it. I mean, first of all, we wanted to include them. It was very important that this not happen around them, but it happened through them, in them. And so we involved them from the get-go, especially when it came time to participate in the concession booths, the food. I think we had 20 food concessionaires, and I think we may have charged $20 to set up a booth with 20. So we didn't charge them more than anything. And the restaurants, there was a black church out there that had a booth. And after the second jazz, they had been trying for years to build a church sanctuary. And because they couldn't raise the money, every Sunday they had been meeting in somebody else's church. And after the second year, they had raised enough money to build their sanctuary. Strickland's restaurant there, if you recall, Strickland's restaurant was right there at the ferry slip. And Strickland, they were very, very thoughtful to us and very kind in the beginning. They let us use their parking lot across the street for our jeweled art show. They let us use property behind them and around them for these concession stands to go. And it turns out, Strickland told me afterwards, we made more money that one day than we made in 6 months. So it benefited a lot of different kind of folks out there. But we involved them from the very get-go.
Great. Well, Mike, you made the comment when you first started, when you went out there, you said you didn't know anything about jazz, but you knew something about Western, you knew something about country music and something about rock and roll. All right, if you didn't know anything about jazz, who helped you? Because thinking back, the entertainers those first couple of years were off the charts.
Spyro Gyra alone would have been a hell of a concert.
But who and how did you come up with the entertainers, Mike?
Well, first of all, I should have said this in the very beginning. We had incredible support, volunteer support. If you remember, Mayor Godbow had one hell of a political organization, and they were there to call on, and they were anxious and willing to do whatever it was we asked. And that formed another network, and through that network, I met a fellow up in Fernandina, who was a jazz aficionado. And so he would sit with me and he would play records. And he would say, now this is somebody you might want to get. But I don't think you're going to deal with this one over here. And he would tell me who they were. And I'd do a little research. I met the guy who was the jazz critic for the New Orleans Times-Picayune, who then went into becoming an agent for jazz artists in New Orleans. and he was very helpful to me. And then I met another agent up in New York who was very helpful to me. And so I learned over a period of time. Of course, you know what, you begin to hear the names. Well, how can I get that person? And you also got to keep in mind, back in those days, jazz artists were cheap. They didn't cost like a rock and roll star or a country western star. They were pretty damn cheap. So you could get a big name jazz person for $5,000. And I think we paid Dizzy Gillespie about $5,000 the first year he came. So I counted on those people.
I'm sure Taylor Swift would come in for $5,000, don't you think so? And do an hour?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, 50 minutes, because we need 10 minutes to strike this up.
Yeah, you got it.
How about the name All That Jazz? Mayport and All That Jazz. Is that the Bob Fosse reference?
Yeah, that was. It was a play in a movie. And I think it was probably popular about that time. But I went to the Times Union Day to Peddlers Festival with the press, and Ann Hyman was a columnist for those folks, a wonderful woman. And so I'm walking through the newsroom, and we start talking, and she said, well, what are you going to call it? And I said, I don't know yet, Ann. Hadn't come to that yet. She said, how about Mayport and All That Jazz? I said, that's what we're going to call it. And that's what we called it. In fact, I happen to have a 42-year-old T-shirt. I don't know if you can see this or not.
By the way, it was from the Fosse film, because the film came out in 1979.
There you go.
Roy Scheider was in that. It was just great.
Yeah. Well, All That Jazz, there's no question about it. All That Jazz, and it only made sense for us to hitch onto that star, you know? So we hitched onto that star.
Well, Mike, it's very obvious. You've told us about the logistics. Now, those first couple ones, tell us about some of the memories. I mean, this is 40 some odd years ago. There's got to be a couple memories that just jump out that you will never ever forget.
For that first festival, it obviously starts with Della and Reese. By the time Della and Reese came in around 8 o'clock or whatever, the crowd was as big as it was going to get. I mean, it was huge. And they knew that Della and Reese was coming next. And they started chanting, Della, 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 Della. And I'm sure we could have heard it in Jacksonville Beach. It was so loud. So to get to the stage, she had to walk through the crowd. So you watch the crowd part. You watch that crowd part as she walked between them, yelling, Della, Della, Della. And then her performance was just out of sight. It was unbelievable. And I remember sitting there. I'd probably had something to smoke, but I remember sitting there that night, and the breeze was blowing. I watched the breeze, and I watched some shrimp boats go up and down, and I'm thinking, this is as good as heaven right here, man. It ain't going to get no better than this. So about 7 o'clock that night, we only had a few police officers there. We didn't know we were going to have that many people. I think they said 70,000 people showed up, and we didn't know we were going to have that. So we only had a few police officers. So about 7 o'clock, the officer in charge came over to me, and he said, Mike, the traffic is backed up on Atlantic Boulevard all the way to University Boulevard trying to get in here. What should we do? I said, tell them to turn around and go home. There's no way they're going to get in here. And he stood, I swear, he looked at me and he said, that's your job. And he turned around and walked off and went to a bar in Jacksonville Beach. And that's a true story.
Tell us about the seating situation. Was there like a VIP section like they used to do with Starry Nights?
We weren't that sophisticated back then. We ended up doing that.
So it was lawn chairs?
Yeah. It was in the street, in the trees, on the rooftops. They were all over the place. Wherever they could get, they were. And so we were sophisticated. Later on, we developed a group of people, patrons or whatever, I forget what we call them, but people who paid extra money. And we had a big party on Friday night just for them, patrons party. But that happened, I think, in the third year. I think that's when that came about. But just getting them in and getting them out was a big deal.
How long did it take to make a decision to have the second Mayport All That Jazz Festival?
Actually, probably before the first one was over.
Well, but there must have been some extraordinary comments and outpouring of just the wow factor. Do you remember that, or do you remember some of it?
Yeah, I do, Mike Hightower. And if you go back to what I said at the beginning, Jake was always looking for a way to promote the city and make the people who live here feel good about living in Jacksonville. And so one of the first things I thought after it was all over with and the next day or so was we started that process pretty well. This was a good step in that direction. And so we had done that. I think if we had said we weren't going to do a second one, people might have attacked City Hall or something. I don't know, because it really was. And to this day, I run into people who may have been to 20 jazz festivals, but if they're with that first one, that's when you will remember it and it's their favorite.
You talked about being at the beach. With all that success at Mayport, though, you decide to move it to a new location, away from small little Mayport, which is right on the river, and you picked Met Park. What caused that decision?
Well, let me give you a little background before I tell you exactly that. The next year of the festival was at Mayport again, and that was the first year. 81, and that was the first year we had Dizzy Gillespie. And by then we had gotten a little bit smarter on organization and transportation. So a couple of things happened to help us out. One was the Navy agreed to let us park cars on their runways out there adjacent to Mayport. You think, that can't happen today. The second thing was we worked with the Transportation Authority. I think it was even called the JEA, Jacksonville Expressway Authority back then. Can't recall. And we had satellite buses. So we set up satellite buses in parking lots at the beach. And at certain times of the day, those buses would carry people out to Mayport and then make a return trip and bring people back that wanted to come back. So that helped a lot with logistics. And let me tell you a couple of things about that next festival. Actually, that was the first time we had Dizzy Gillespie. And he was in Amsterdam. Think about this. He was performing in Amsterdam. He flew from Amsterdam to JIA. We picked him up in a helicopter, flew him to Mayport, and brought him into the festival. He played. He had a band come in. I think 4 guys come in from New York City, rather than have his group. They were in Amsterdam, come in from New York City, and at the end of his, we paid him a deposit like we paid everybody. We paid him maybe half of what we need to pay him, and we had a check ready for him after he got through that afternoon. And I went to give him his check, and he said, "I need cash." And I said, "What do you mean you need cash?" He said, "Well, I got to pay my guys because they're going back to New York City, and I need cash." Thank God it was the second year, not the first, because people trusted us out there. So I had somebody go around to all the vendors, signing the IOUs until we got enough cash together to pay Dizzy Gillespie. And somewhere there's a photograph of us paying Gillespie in a motorhome that night. And I'll tell you another thing about that second one that was important to me. That was the first year that we had Marcus Roberts. Marcus was a young blind pianist and down to blind school in St. Augustine. And he was from Jacksonville. And I always wanted to have a Jacksonville component. And I heard about this kid who everybody said was great. He was giving a recital or a concert down at the school on a Sunday afternoon in order to raise money to try to help fund his trip to Europe to play with the jazz youth band. And I went and listened to him, and I thought, my goodness gracious, his 17-year-old kid is absolutely amazing. And so after it was over, I went up to him and introduced myself, and I told him, I said, "Marcus, I'll give you $300 right now if you will agree to come to be in the next jazz festival. And of course, he did. He agreed to that. Well, by the time it came around, we had signed a deal with Channel 7 and PBS to do an hour-long special from the jazz festival. And so I had Dizzy Gillespie, Phil Woods, a saxophone player, and I said, I want Marcus Roberts to be in that. And so we got Marcus another $500. Then we fast forward. The next year, I told Marcus, I said, you got to win the piano competition. I created the Great American Jazz Piano Competition that first year. And I said, Marcus, you got to win that contest to be in the festival this year. I'm not going to put you back in it again unless you win that festival. And we had a blind audition. People submitted tapes from all over. I had a group of judges. I was not involved. But anyhow, they picked Marcus, Harry Connick Jr., and three other guys, five finalists. And we had the first piano competition over to Sheridan Hotel in that lounge, a bar. I had Dr. Billy Taylor as one judge. I had the jazz critic from the time was picking in as a judge, and the jazz critic from the New York Times as a judge. Marcus won the competition. Harry Connick Jr., who was 16, came in second. That's a pretty good beginning.
This year, the corporate sponsors for this year's Jazz Festival are Publix and JAA, the Aviation Authority. Did you have corporate sponsors back at the first and second and third years of this to help defray those costs? And who were they?
Well, I had some. I didn't have a lot. I'll tell you, the foundation of it all was Channel 12, W2LV. Channel 12 came in, I got them to come in as a sponsor early on. And they promoted the living hell out of this thing. So that helped a great deal. But it didn't keep other stations from also helping us and promoting us. But Channel 12 was a great partner. I think that we had a beer distributorship as a partner. But we didn't have many. But it didn't cost us a lot back then.
What was the decision to move it to Met Park?
A couple of things happened. One was the Navy decided they didn't want to let us park there anymore. So that created a problem. And second was we just knew it was too small. We had filled every inch that we could fill, and it was just getting complicated. Third was that the people of Mayport, some of the people at Mayport had started getting greedy. They had done really well. I can tell you, the second year, I had a blueprint, a diagram of where all of the booths were going to go for the festival, and I went out to Strickland's to meet with Mr. Strickland. It was going to be important that he knew all this because it was using a lot of his property like we did the first year. And I got there, and he said, we're not going to do like that this year. We're going to put bars on our property around, and nobody else can use our property this time. And I told him, I said, if you do that, we can't have the festival. Well, that would defeat the purpose of having this event. And he said, well, that's just the way it's going to be. So on the way back to City Hall, I made a point to stop at every vendor, every little group that had a concession, and say, I'm sorry we're not going to be able to do the festival this year because Mr. Strickland won't let you use his property. Well, by the time I got back to my office in City Hall, he was calling me to talk again because they would come down on him like a pencil eggs. But they got a little greedy out there. Not everybody, but it just became too much for that little area, for sure. And to answer your question, how I picked Metropolitan Park, everybody wanted the festival. If you were in Springfield, you were in the festival. If you were in Riverside, you were in the festival. Wherever you were, the beaches wanted it. So making a decision was difficult. Back then, Metropolitan Park was a parking lot, a dirt, muddy, sometimes when it rained, parking lot on the river that was used twice a year, basically when the Gator Bowl game and the Georgia-Florida game were played. And that was about it. Maybe sometimes during the fair, I don't know. But I went over and started walking that property and looking at that property. And it's so beautiful over there. We're on the river. Here we wanted to be on the water. And I went back and I told the mayor, I said, we need to move this festival to Metropolitan Park. And he agreed with it. And so we moved it there. The first year, we just set everything up kind of like we had at Mayport. We learned a lot. Our stages were a lot better, and a lot of things. But we set the concession stand where we were. And it turned out that was exactly what happened the next year when Metropolitan Park opened officially. The architect I worked with on the design of that park, and he put the stage pretty much where we had the stage, and he put concession areas around this level. We pretty much had it. But that's how we chose Metropolitan Park.
Jake never lost that passion or that vision of what he wanted for the everyday guy in Jacksonville and woman for Jacksonville. That's what comes through this.
And don't forget, he also he did get his fishing tournament.
Yeah, he got his
So he got his fishing tournament, the kingfish.
Yeah, exactly.
But you think about that. He knew how to leverage people in Washington or Tallahassee to do things, but he always did it. It had people like you, but he never forgot just the everyday guy. And I think that he never lost that passion for the everyday guy in Jacksonville.
No, and I go back, Mike. I want to go back to what I said earlier. He had people working for him, volunteering for him, since I knew him, since I first met him when he was a young city councilman. He had this organization that only grew, and these people were dedicated. And all I had to do was say, this is the task over here. Here's what we need to be doing. Help me out. Go do it. And they'd do it. And so I had that to rely on. I didn't have to go look for people to help. They were already there. And that was a big deal for me. That was a really big deal.
My understanding that 1983, that was the
second year at Mayport.
Second year at Mayport. My understanding is
second year at Metro Park.
At Metro Park. Right. That is, you sort of view that as just the cherry on top of the cake. Why?
Well, first of all, we had that new park, and the Jazz Festival opened up that new park. I remember that I brought in a jazz release of funeral bands from New Orleans, and that's how we opened the park. The funeral band came in and played, and everybody. In fact, we put the guy with the umbrella in the back of a hearse in a casket, and we brought it in, and they get the casket out. I mean, it's all this music slow, funeral music, and they get the casket out. And they open up the casket, and the guy with the umbrella pops out, and now then it's going, But that we opened that up. But what was significant is, remember now, at the second Jazz Festival, PBS did a 1-hour show. It was taped, and it played in about 200 American cities. The PBS came back and opened up their fall season that year, the next year, with an 8-hour live telecast from Mayport. Well, I think we still call it Mayport and all that jazz, but the Jazz Festival at the new Metropolitan Park. 8 stinking hours live. And Steve Allen, the great Steve Allen, and Dr. Billy Taylor were co-hosts. We had our guests that year were just absolutely amazing. I remember I always liked to do a jam session at the end with some of the big name entertainers. And I remember we had Buddy Rich, the drummer, and we had Art Blakey, the drummer, and they were supposed to play at the same time. We were going to have some dueling drums, And Buddy Rich was very temperamental, and Rich decided at the last minute he didn't even do it. He wasn't going to do it. Sarah Vaughan was also supposed to be in the jam, and she decided at the last minute she didn't want to do it. So I had Woody Herman and Gillespie and 3 or 4 other guys doing it. Rich is standing off over in the side of the stage, and he's seeing everybody have such a damn good time that he tells me to get somebody to get his drums out there. So we moved his drums out there. Next thing I know, Sarah Vaughan is saying, I want to go out there. Woody Herman, and Woody Herman and his band were playing. They were part of the group. Woody Herman was. So she would go out there and be with Woody. So she went out there and performed. And that's how we closed out that 8-hour television show. But it was amazing.
Wow. No wonder that's your. I mean, how do you beat that?
You can't.
And the spontaneity of watching that many, the egos, but having it at the end of the day, everybody wanted to be part of something bigger than they were.
Well, I still can't get over $5,000 for each performance. Could you imagine?
Let me freelance for a minute and just share some memories with you that I think you'll find interesting without any order. But the first year, on that Friday before the festival on Saturday, we were setting up in Mayport, building the concession stands, building the stage, getting all that ready. And these two young ladies from the health department came up to me, and they said, Mr. Tolbert, we hate to tell you this, but you're not going to be able to have any concessions tomorrow. And I said, what do you mean we're not going to have any concessions tomorrow? And one of them said, well, you forgot to get the permits. And I said, you're right, I forgot to get the permits. I'm so sorry. I said, would y'all come with me? And so they followed me into Strickland's restaurant, and I went to the phone. And I called Pat Calvey with it. I called the director of the health department, the head of the health department, Dr. Pat Calvey. And I said, Pat, I'm here with two of your very nice people, and they're telling me that Mayor Godbout can't have his concessions tomorrow. Would you mind explaining to them how they can help us get those permits? And I handed the phone to them. He said, girls, we got our permits, and they became permanent health department volunteers for us for everything else we did after that. Then, in the first year at Metropolitan Park, one of the things I did was I had a piano. I forget what we call it, but there were three world famous pianists playing three pianos. And one of them was George Shearing, the great George Shearing. And before he went on to start, they played individually, and then they came and played all three together. But anyhow, before he went on to play, he told me, he said, look, I don't play when there's noise. Now, you can imagine, we're on a stage, there are thousands of people out there. Well, so I went out and I said, I want to ask a favor of everybody. Mr. Shearing has said it's difficult for him to perform when there's a lot of noise. So I would ask you not to make noise until he finishes a number, and then applaud like if you want to. And who knew if that was going to work? I had this vision of George Shearing get up walking off the stage because somebody was talking loud. And so I introduced him. He came out. He played the first number, and I'll never forget this. There was a young black man sitting in the front row. He had his shirt off. It was a warm October day. He had his shirt off. And when Sharon got done playing that first song, this guy stood up and started yelling and waving that shirt and clapping. And everybody clapped, but they all cooperated. But we had to get three grand pianos on that stage. We had only one in Jackson we could find. They had to be, I forget what they had to be, but we found one. They had two brought in from Tampa. But that memory of that guy waving that shirt, it was just an incredible memory. I've got a bunch of those.
Your last festival was the fifth one in 1984. Why was it your last, Mike?
Politics. Pretty much politics. Mayor Godbout and Fred Redmond, he was the head of Channel 7, didn't get along real well. Frankly, I didn't get along with Fred very well either. That last festival, I ended up writing a check for $10,000 because Jake would not release the TDC funds for the festival because he was mad at Redmond, and Redmond wouldn't help us raise any money because he was mad at Jake. And so, and then that fifth festival was absolutely outstanding. Again, once more time, and I thought, you know what, it ain't going to get any better than this for me. And so I said I'm going to quit. And I did, and I walked away from it. And I don't regret that. I don't regret that. I would tell you, one thing I do all the time, especially about this time of the year, is I salute those people like Teresa Price O'Donnell, who came after me, and Dan Dunsoff and those people. who kept it going all these years. Because every year when the festival comes around, as long as I'm alive, I said, maybe somebody will remember, you know?
Right.
Yeah. Well, this has been an incredible program. Thank you, Mike, so much for the memories. Let me do a little bit of housekeeping here.
You guys to let me share.
No, thank you.
Here's some housekeeping stuff that I put together, and you will see there will be a graphic coming up on the show if you're watching this, where you can click onto it and go to the Jacksonville Jazz Festival homepage where you can get all of this information. But this year's Jazz Festival will be held May 23rd through May 26th. It'll be at the Florida Theater on Thursday the 23rd. That's where they traditionally hold the piano competition. And then 2 different venues for the rest of the weekend. One will be at Met Park, so they're still there, and the other will be at Daly's Place. On Friday, entertainment begins at 4 o'clock, goes to 11 o'clock. Saturday and Sunday begins at 3 o'clock and goes to 11 o'clock. And I would tell you all of the names of the performers who are going to be there this year, but that would take us another 45 minutes. So I'm just going to say, go to the website, take a look. I will tell you this, Joss Stone is coming in for Sunday, and I can't wait for that one. She's phenomenal. But anyhow, it's been a great show. Mike Tolbert, thank you very, very much. Mike Hightower, always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Good to have you.
Thank you. Mike, thank you. I'm just thinking what you just said, all this going on. Mike Tolbert, the little town, tiny town of Mayport, 1 road in, 1 road out, and now it's a 3-day, unbelievable, world-known celebration of Jacksonville. Mike Tolbert, you done good, my friend. Thank you. God bless you.
Starting next week, we're going to start delving into the stadium renovation issue. The City Council now has its copy of it. The meetings have been held around town. They held 5 of them during the month of May. So in June, we're going to be focusing on this and talking about it over the extent of about 2 or 3 different shows because it's that important. This is the biggest ticket item that has ever been faced in Jacksonville for the taxpayers relating to the Jaguars. So we hope you'll tune in. I just love it when it's just the 3 of us jabbering. I love the guests that we've had on. They've added so much to this program. But when the 3 of us get together, you just don't know what direction it's going to go. And that, to me, is more fun than most anything else I can think of indoors.
I've decided it needs to be changed for Mike's and Mike's into 3 curmudgeons. And Mr. Tolbert, being the senior and most quoted curmudgeon, maybe that's what we'd start with Tolbert, the senior curmudgeon.
There you go.
There you go. Mike, thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you once again to the Jacksonville Historical Society.
Thanks.
We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.
Mike's on Mike with Mike Tolbert, Mike Hightower, and Mike Miller can be found on your favorite podcasting platform, Facebook, and YouTube. Visit the website at mikesonmike.com. Join us next time for more conversation with Mike's on Mike.